You are listening to the Visualising War and Peace podcast. In each episode, we look at how people have experienced, described, or imagined armed conflict in different periods and places, and we discuss the impact which representations of war and peace can have on us as individuals and societies. Hello, my name is Alice Koenig, and I direct the Visualising War and Peace project at the University of St Andrews. My guest today is Anne Lene Stein, a PhD student in the Department of Political Science at Lund University in Sweden. Regular listeners will know that Anna has been on the podcast before, discussing her research on peace activism in Israel and Palestine. We've invited her back to share another important strand of research with us, based on her fieldwork with Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. So Anna, welcome back to the Visualising War and Peace podcast, and thank you for joining me again for this follow-up conversation.
Hello, and good to be back.
So last time we spoke, we focused on different approaches to peace activism in both Israel and Palestine, and the challenges of visualizing a more peaceful future, especially in the wake of the most recent conflict between Israel and Hamas. Today, we're going to keep thinking about peace imaginaries and the challenges of visualizing a future beyond conflict, but we're going to connect this to a topic which the Visualizing War and Peace project did some work on in 2023, and that's forced displacement. And of course, this is a recurring legacy of conflict all around the world. So in recent years alone, wars in Syria, Afghanistan, Ukraine, Sudan, just to name a few, have displaced millions of people from their homes. And of course, it is a particularly acute issue for thousands of people in Gaza right now. But as your research underlines, it's not a new phenomenon at all for many Palestinians. Palestinians have been seeking sanctuary in lots of different places for many, many years. Our conversation today is going to focus on Lebanon, where some Palestinian people have been living as refugees for multiple generations. Of course, as we've said, there are many other Palestinian people experiencing what it's like to be a refugee all around the world. So Anna, can you get us started by telling us when displaced Palestinians first started seeking sanctuary in Lebanon in large numbers and why?
Sure. So Palestinian refugees have been living in Lebanon basically since 1948. It all started with the creation of the Israeli state, what the Palestinians refer to as the Al-Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe, which means that Palestinians live in Lebanon in the third and fourth generation from the oldest refugees, which means we have a community of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon for more than 75 years now. Basically, with the creation of the Israeli state in 1948 and then the subsequent first Israeli-Arab war that started right after the declaration of Israeli independence, many Palestinian families, particularly from the north of Palestine, fled to Lebanon and haven't been allowed to return since then. However, I also think it's important to mention that a lot of Palestinians had already been expelled by various Zionist forces even before the 15th of May 1948. So, for example, from Haifa, 95% of its Palestinian residents were already expelled when the Israeli state declared its independence. And a lot of refugees in Lebanon are actually from areas around Haifa. And a lot of families who are now refugees in Lebanon still have their keys and ownership documents to their property in what is now Israel. And also, for example, in Haifa, we can still see Palestinian houses, for example, in the neighborhood of Wadi Salib. But most of these buildings are sealed off right now. And when I was there earlier this year, I visited this particular neighborhood and I saw a lot of these historic Palestinian buildings who still have owners in Lebanon. However, in the past 2 decades, most property has been sold by the Israeli government to private and public real estate companies. So by now, they're actually becoming Jewish neighborhoods as the Palestinian citizens of Israel often cannot afford these prices. We have Palestinians who live in Lebanon since 1948, and their refugee camps, which initially actually consisted of tents and homemade shelters, by now have developed into concrete refugee camps that resembles much more underdeveloped urban areas or urban slum areas nowadays than what we actually think about as refugee camps.
Mm-hmm. So a very long-running situation, 75 years, as you say, resulting in multiple generations living in these urban slums that no longer look like temporary refugee camps, as you say. What kinds of numbers are we talking about? Do we have accurate figures for the number of Palestinian refugees currently living in Lebanon?
Well, that's a bit tricky. Population numbers are very hard to come by. I just checked the numbers that the United Nations Relief and Work Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, uses. And of March last year, the total number of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon registered with the UN agency was roughly 489,000 persons. On top of that, the records from UNRWA shows that a total of 31,000 Palestinian refugees from Syria are actually also residing in Lebanon currently. However, to understand the number UNRWA has, it is important to know that registration with the agency is voluntary. So that means that death as well as immigration remains unreported, and refugee can continue registering actually newborns even if they have moved abroad, because there's an online system that allows to register. But why do Palestinians actually want to register with UNRWA? Because in theory, the refugee status with UNRWA actually secures their right to return one day. So for Palestinians, they actually see UNRWA as a symbol of like an international commitment to achieving Palestinians' right to return to the land that they were forced to leave 75 years ago. So that's why UNRWA has such high numbers of registered Palestinians. But when I was there in 2017, for the first time ever, Lebanon actually did a census among the Palestinian refugees, and not only included camps, but also the Palestinians who do live in informal Palestinian settlements outside these camps. So they actually went from door to door and they made a heart count, and they reported a total of 174,000 persons, which is significantly less than the official number UNRWA has, right? They also found out that a total of 45% of the refugees are estimated to live in one of the 12 refugee camps, which is also a bit lower. So the numbers are very unclear here, like there's a huge discrepancy. But we also have the number of roughly 200,000 Palestinian refugees in Lebanon who access UNRWA services every year. So if we kind of combine these different numbers, the current estimate is that we have roughly around 250,000 refugees currently residing in the country.
Thank you. As you say, very complicated and political reasons for Palestinian people to continue registering as refugees, securing that right to return and keeping alive that international commitment. So you have spent some time doing field work in these refugee camps, the 12 refugee camps that you mentioned, which, as we've said, exist in something of a limbo between permanence and impermanence, 75 years and counting, but still, in theory, a temporary home which Palestinian refugees hope to leave behind one day and return. Can you help us picture what life is like in these camps, how they're organized, what kinds of resources they have, and perhaps where the funding and the infrastructure comes from and the political dynamics within these camps?
So it's going to be another long but complicated answer, I am afraid, so please bear with me here. So let's start with the governance and the complex power structures in these camps. So in general, I think it's important to remember that these camps are under Lebanese sovereignty as they are on Lebanese territory, of course. However, the Lebanese state does not assume any kind of responsibility. So what does that mean for the governance of these Palestinian camps? And if we go back to the beginning and to the establishment of the camps in the 1950s, we see that they were designed as these temporary spaces and not as spaces that would last for actually 75 years. So since the beginning, the responsibility for the refugee community in Lebanon has always been with the UNRWA, with the UN agency that I have already mentioned. So they are the responsible agent for the Palestinian refugee community. However, the situation is a bit more complicated because the Palestine Liberation Organization under Yasser Arafat, the PLO, they negotiated in 1969 an agreement with the Lebanese government. And the result of this agreement was that the camps came solely under the authority of the PLO. So since 1969, the Lebanese security forces have been banned from entering the camps, and security is provided by various armed Palestinian factions since then. So we have a situation where between 1969 and 1982, the PLO is present in the camp, and they establish various social, legal, economic, and political institutions. And by that, they were the main source of employment. But then we have the outbreak of the Lebanese civil war. And in 1982, Israel's invasion, which then led to the expulsion of the PLO to Tunisia and the end of the civil war, which all of this together changed the situation dramatically for the Palestinians, as like with the expulsion of the PLO, also most institutions and the livelihood for them just disappeared. And also the Palestinians, they played a role in the civil war. However, they were never included in any kind of post-war reconciliation and disarmament processes, but rather they were blamed for the civil war. And we have a lot of parties and citizens, even nowadays, that oppose kind of like a permanent resettlement and integration into the Lebanese society because of that. So now we actually have a situation in post-war Lebanon where there's no PLO, but the political structures of the camps are still the same. So they were never adjusted. And the camps kept their political autonomy, which is rather exceptional. There's no other Palestinian refugee community in the region that has political autonomy over their camps. So nowadays we have the camps and they are governed by so-called popular committees. And these are factions or people who are appointed by the Palestinian embassy in Beirut or by the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. It's not elected, they're appointed, and we have a lot of different rival factions, and most of them, they work on undermining each other and they're competing over influence and over like resources and so on, right? And then because the Lebanese army and police is not responsible for the security of these camps, we also have security committees who kind of function as the police. But that also means that these camps, although they have political authority, they are spaces without law and law enforcement. That leads to the result that a lot of criminals seek shelter in these camps because they are law-free spaces, so to say. And it's not only Palestinians, but it's also Lebanese criminals and also Syrians. It creates a huge problem for these camps. Once in a while, the Lebanese army or police do enter to arrest these individuals if they are important enough. Mm-hmm. But the Lebanese state, the only thing they actually do is they subject the camps to stricter security measures, including closer demarcations of the boundaries of the camps. Some camps are secured by armed Palestinian members of the various political factions, but other camps are secured by the Lebanese military, and then they request permits from every non-Palestinian. If you want to enter, you have to get a special permit from the Lebanese army in order to be allowed. But they're also searching every single car of every Palestinian inhabitant of the camps, because they're looking for weapons, but they're also looking for construction material, for example, because Palestinians are not allowed to bring construction material into the camps. So it's very complex in terms of power structure and political dynamics, but it's also very insecure spaces as there's no law and law enforcement. However, Lebanon has the highest percentage of camp-dwelling refugees, and we have around 45% of the Palestinian refugee population who actually live in one of these 12 UNRWA refugee camps. And as I said, UNRWA is responsible for the camps and the inhabitants. So the agency provides relief and assistance, and they are mandated to do so from the international community. So they provide healthcare, education, relief, and social services, but they're also responsible for the camp infrastructure, for improvement activities, and emergency assistance. And even though these camps actually exist since 1949, more or less, and are now part of the urban setting, they still lack sufficient housing. So we can think of these camps as mazes of roads and paths. There's a chaos of electricity cables and water pipes, which is super dangerous. The houses are often many floors high because the camps are not allowed to expand. So the numbers of inhabitants is rising. So people have to build more floors on top of their already existing houses to find or to make space. We have very little direct sunlight because these houses are so high. And there's no camp planning in general, which means it is basically impossible to think about green spaces, common areas, or recreational facilities. It's just housing. And they have a lot of infrastructural problems: poor ventilation, poor building material, also very dangerous, poor sanitation, limited access to water and electricity. So the camps in general have turned into very unhealthy structures and living spaces. Although we have seen a rising or increasing number of asylum seekers, like from the Syrian civil war in the last years, and a lot of Palestinians who lived in Syria actually fled to Lebanon and now also residing in these same refugee camps, the camps are not allowed to expand. So we have more people in the same space that already was available before. Palestinians can reside outside the camp, but then they face constant threats of expulsion. And I think what is also very important to mention here is if they don't reside in one of the camps, then they lose the entitlement for the UNRWA assistance, which they often need for their survival or to meet their basic human needs. Because according to UNRWA, the poverty rate among Palestinian refugees is very high in Lebanon, with approximately 80% reported to be living below the national poverty line. With that, it's actually one of the most underprivileged Palestinian refugee communities in the regions. To kind of sum it up a bit, as I said, they have political autonomy, but they suffer a lot from marginalization and discrimination. So Palestinian refugees in Lebanon are legally labeled stateless foreigners, which means they have basically no human and civic rights, as they have no citizenship, because both of this is connected to the citizenship in Lebanon. They're not allowed to participate in political decision-making processes in Lebanon, but also not in the camp. And they lack the right to work. So the Lebanese state actually prohibits Palestinians from working in many qualified professions, for example, in medicine or engineering and law. So they're not allowed to work in these professions. And even if they work in permitted fields, they most often do not benefit from fundamental social rights and services such as salary payment in case of illness or maternity leave. Mm-hmm. So Palestinians are excluded from the labor market, more or less. Those who can find jobs are often forced to work in very low wages without any insurance securities. And on top of that, they're not allowed to own property, and they have limited access to government services and national educations because that is seen as being UNRWA's responsibility.
Thank you for that really helpful picture of a very complex situation. And clearly these camps are very challenging spaces for all sorts of reasons, as you've outlined: poverty, lack of housing, lack of sunlight and green spaces, problems with sanitation, but also these power struggles within and actually beyond them, with them being caught up in wider conflict, but with also conflict and securitization being a kind of recurring phenomenon within the camps too. You mentioned that there are big consequences for leaving these camps, for moving out, losing your UNRWA assistance, the real challenge of working with no rights, not really having the right to work. You did say that there are informal Palestinian settlements outside the camps. Do you want to say a little bit about that, and a bit more maybe about the challenges of integration within Lebanese society, or the stigma that Palestinian refugees who try to move beyond these camps face?
So you have settlements outside the camps. Often it's actually more like Palestinian neighborhoods, very poor as well, but not under the stigma and the label of a refugee camp. But since the Lebanese government has imposed restrictions on Palestinian refugees in terms of their residency, the integration into society and the access to basic services is very limited. So there's actually those people living in these informal settlements have a problem to kind of meet their basic services because they're not entitled to get it. So they're not integrated into that aspect of social services from the Lebanese side. But also the integration is really difficult because it's very much based on the historical context and identity of the Palestinians. And there's an ongoing political sensitivity surrounding the Palestinian issues that makes it very challenging to address the integration within the Lebanese society, as it's often seen as a potential threat to this very delicate sectarian balance in the country, which we also is a result of the civil war. So if we would actually integrate the Palestinian refugees within the Lebanese society, the delicate sectarian balance would shift in favor for one particular group. So that's also why the integration is very challenging, and it's often opposed from various other groups. And I think that's a very interesting argument, is there are so-called protection concerns. And the Lebanese government has expressed concerns about naturalizing Palestinian refugees, as it could potentially impact the right of return for Palestinians to their homeland. So the official state narrative here is that we do that in order to secure the Palestinian identity and to make sure that they can uphold their right of return. While I would argue they also do it for their own purpose, to not shift the sectarian balance and to kind of create more challenges to their own society and country, because we all know that Lebanon is also a very troubled country itself. Addressing the whole Palestinian issue in that would put much more trouble on the Lebanese state, as it already has a lot to deal with.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. And you've also given us a little bit of a hint at some of the hostility that Palestinian refugees face, for example, being blamed in part by some people, at least, for the Lebanese civil war. In your research, you have paid particular attention to young people's experiences in these Palestinian refugee camps. And we're talking here about people who are third or fourth generation on from the oldest refugees, people who've never lived in Palestine, but for whom Palestine, as you say, is still technically and conceptually home. What did you learn in your conversations with them about their sense of identity and about their everyday lives?
So yes, my research, it revolved particularly around the question, what kind of life, but also what kind of activism or resistance is actually possible under these conditions that I just have described. So from my experience in the camp, and I think that was the starting point of my research back then, I had not only perceived these spaces as spaces of insecurity and vulnerability, which they certainly are, but I also have seen a lot of activities where life actually takes place, where people, particularly the youth, is acting against the dehumanization and their constraints that they experience from so many different sides and from so many different levels. So in my research, I was actually interested to learn more about these micro forms of resistance, or what we can also call everyday form of resistance, from particularly young people in the camps. And I've particularly looked into camps in the north, and the everyday of the Palestinian youth there is very much structured by the space of the camp, of course, and what kind of opportunities are available within the camps. But it's also very much constrained by what the Palestinians and the Lebanese authorities actually allow these youth to do. So the circumstances of the Palestinian youth are marked strongly by tense employment situations, which then lead to a very insecure and challenging living situation because they can't provide for their families. But it also is marked by very corrupt and nepotistic political systems. So the young people are often excluded from the political space of the camp, and they're not part of any kind of relevant decision-making processes when it comes to their own living spaces. On top of that, and I think that is very interesting, is that their everyday life is very much influenced by kind of a dominant discourse in the camp that actually portrays the Palestinians in Lebanon as a refugee community that is temporarily exiled, and therefore it's not in need of an adequate living situation and future prospects. And in this kind of narrative or discourse, any kind of improvement activities of the living standards in the camps are interpreted by the Palestinians who live there as normalization, and that would consequently then also be used as a practical argument for permanent settlement, either in Lebanon or for resettlement somewhere else. So in that sense, I think particularly the youth is stuck in the situation of temporality, as these spaces are designed as like temporal spaces, but they're also very much marked by a sense of immobility. So they can't really move out of these spaces. This temporality, but also immobility, they both hamper their self-determined life in the camps. So there's very little space to navigate. And rather than actually helping youth out of there and kind of like helping them working on improving the living situations, most of the Palestinian elites and political factions actually working on perpetuating an image of a community in paralysis, a community that is very weak, and a community that is in need of help and support in order to maintain their right to return and to uphold their refugee identity. And this is not only maintained by the Palestinians, but I mean, as I have mentioned before, it's also the Lebanese government has also a very strong interest in upholding the status quo and not changing the power structures, because it would ultimately also change their power structures of the Lebanese government and society. But the youth with whom I talk to, they think that this kind of image of the poor Palestinian is not really helpful for them in their pursuit for justice, for example, to claim civic rights from the Lebanese, for example. But they also say it's not really helpful for their right to return. But they rather say it's the opposite, that this kind of image of this victim and the victimhood idea and the dependent position on UNRWA and other humanitarian NGOs who are very present in the camp will not help them in their struggle. It hurts their struggle rather. And I have an interview quote here, which I think is very telling, because that person, when I asked him about his living conditions, he says, but why do we have to live under these circumstances? Being deprived of rights, living under bad housing conditions. We are considered to be guests in Lebanon, but why do we have necessarily to be poor guests and not rich guests? Do you really think we become automatic citizens if we are rich? That's nonsense. So I think that really nicely encapsulates this idea of that also you can have rights and you can have a good living standard, but still uphold the idea of returning and your Palestinian identity.
Really, really interesting and very troubling, of course, but it touches on something that the Visualising War and Peace project is fundamentally interested in, these habits, these dominant habits of visualizing refugees, of visualizing forced displacement in very particular ways. As you said, you've used the language of dependency, victimhood, poverty, and this assumption that you might give up on your refugee identity or cede it or lose it, and the right to return if you break free of these dominant habits of that lots and lots of people have of understanding what refugee experiences are or should be, as it were, and that then proving a real barrier to visualizing any other kind of future, any more positive future, or indeed of taking control of that future. So where do you see this going? You've identified young voices that are discontented with this, that are frustrated, that are quite rightly hoping that things might change. Do you think there is enough momentum that this situation that young people are kind of bound into, lack of power, lack of agency, it's going to kind of carry on for another 50, 25, 75 years? Do you see kind of glimmers or seeds of change that might actually overset these kind of dominant power structures and these dominant narratives and habits of visualizing refugee experiences?
Yes. So in my research, I do identify some of these momentums or tactics or strategies. My research is like from 2018, so it's a couple of years ago, and I think it's too little of a time frame to actually see how much impact they have. But when I talk to my interviewees from back then, I see that those people still work on the same repertoires that they talked about 5 years ago. So I think there at least is hope that something is going to change, and there's the potential for transformation. And I think some of the tactics that the youth talked a lot about, and I think that is very important here, is that they really try to counter these dominant discourses in the camps by creating kind of counter narrative that then try to disseminate in different ways. And it's like, so they have these counter narratives, like in a dominant one, camps and are characterized as places of insecurity and vulnerability. But the youth, they really try to highlight it's actually spaces of creative resistance and political agency that has the potential to undermine these power relations and transform the society. And I think it's that belief in it that is so important here, because they believe that they have a political agency and a potential. And like some of the repertoires were and things that they were working on, for example, is that they really try to create opportunities to lower the dependency on the political factions by, for example, volunteering. Most of the volunteering is actually paid in the camps, and by that the youth has their own money and is less dependent on political factions support. It's the same for NGO work. Also, often these NGOs actually perpetuating this image of the poor Palestinian. But again, if they work for them and they have their own income, it again lowers the dependency on the factions. There's a lot of youth club activity without a political agenda. Again, because you have a lot of youth clubs from the factions, the political factions. If you open different ones that are not connected to the political factions, again, you lower the dependency. But you also keep the youth busy. And so you create alternatives that they're not becoming part of any armed factions or becoming part of drug cartels that are also active in the camps. They try to press for elections. It's a very common theme in the camps that they try to install elections on different levels to get some political agency. There's a lot of discussion about how to do these elections and whether change through the process or direct change in the question of who is in power. So it's a question, is it a long-term or a short-term strategy? A lot of youth is actually working on improving the Lebanese-Palestinian relationship. So they identify the Lebanese as a strategic partner for the improvement of their living situation and to overcome all these stereotypes and enemy images, because a lot of young people actually believe that they need the support of the Lebanese youth in their fight for their rights and to achieve sustainable and long-lasting improvements in the camps, because they have a very hard time to advocacy for their own rights when it comes to the Lebanese. So they need strategic counterparts there to help. But I think what I found most impressive in very concrete terms is they try to use the space of the camp as a space of belonging, creativity, and openness. And this aspect is kind of clearly demonstrated in various attempts to beautify the space, actually. And they're using arts, murals, and paintings, and so on to make the space more livable. But the walls are not only beautified, they're also used in particular to express a feeling of belonging to the camp. So you see a lot of like belonging to Bedawi refugee camp, but you also see murals that kind of express a feeling of belonging to the whole Palestinian community. So they're kind of creating a space of identification with Palestine and with the camp at the same time. So they kind of incorporate the camp in their visual landscape of their homeland, of Palestine, which I think it's very fascinating. And this kind of space of creativity is also present in a lot of like poetry and music and readings in the camp. The youth tries to open up these spaces that is not purely about like meeting basic human needs, but also for like personal entertainment, enjoyment, and pleasure. And I think by using the space of the camp in these kind of creative and open ways, the youth contributes to a transformation of the place and a visualization of the people within the space beyond the image of the poor Palestinian, because it portrays something different from how we actually think about them. And I think young people seem to use art and social media as their own channel to contribute to their ideas and hopes for peace, because all the formal ways seem to be so closed, and the space for open expression and participation has been shrinking for a while. So art remains as one of the few opportunities to express their thoughts about peace and their futures and their hopes and contribute to it in a certain way. As nice as this sounds, I think the situation is nevertheless very complicated, because the youth themselves are in a position that is very ambivalent. They work for political change, but they depend on the factions to pressure the Lebanese authority and UNRWA. So they also need to work with them to some extent. Again, they're financially dependent, as the factions provide jobs and scholarships for the university, for example. And that creates dependency in a very limited space for open rebellion and political dissent. So you very rarely see demonstration, protest against the political factions, for example. Even if there's a lot of dissent in these camps, it's not openly articulated because you're dependent. So it limits your space. So I think, to summarize, while the youth themselves believe in the temporality of their own community and their return to their homeland, which is very important to them still, they do not agree with the consequences this politics of temporality actually implies for them. But they work for an improvement and self-empowerment of their living situation through various hidden and open activities. And by locating their everyday resistance within this discourse of temporalization, they are actually creating a common ground for improvement, self-empowerment, and exile without abandoning their right of return and their connectedness with the broader Palestinian community and their homeland.
Thank you. So a really important caveat that they're still operating with extraordinary limitations, with this dependency within these politics of temporality. So it's important not to romanticize what these young people are doing. But I'm really struck by the way in which stories are really at the center, storytelling and discourses are really at the center. And this is something that lots of other guests on the podcast have talked about. Lena Fadel, for example, who came on the podcast in 2023, talked about the tyranny of the single narrative in direct relation to refugee stories. And it sounds to me that that's exactly one of the things that these youth in the Palestinian refugee camps are pushing back against. They're offering alternative narratives, counter narratives, unpacking the dominant tyranny of the single narrative that reduces them to victimhood and perpetuates the politics of temporality. And I'm really interested that there's this combination of placemaking and future building with the beautification of the camps and the use of different art forms, music, poetry, visual arts themselves, and indeed social media. And really sort of this idea that if you are able to use these different art forms and these different kinds of storytelling, then you actually might start to affect change, the world building nature of stories. Really, really interesting. So glimmers of hope, but still huge challenges. And you've sketched already in the conversation the extraordinarily challenging living circumstances, the physical challenges, but also the psychological challenges of living in this state of temporality, and the political challenges and the stigmatization and so on. So the experiences of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon helps us grasp the very wide ramifications of the ongoing conflict between people in Israel and Palestine, and wider refugee experiences too. In the last few months, of course, we've seen many thousands more Palestinians displaced from their homes, as well as thousands killed and thousands other traumatized in multiple ways. And of course, victims in Israel as well. I want to ask you, as we start to wrap up, a little bit about the future. Obviously, how, where, and for how long people recently displaced from Gaza should be treated as refugees is a really, really challenging, really contentious, political, not just humanitarian question. But are there useful lessons that we can learn from refugee experiences in Lebanon for the current context?
Yes, I have actually talked to some of my Palestinian friends about this question because I thought it would be really interesting to hear what they think about this as they live this life, right? And what they think could be useful lessons. And they also said that they think it's very difficult to draw any kind of useful lessons for the refugee experience in the current context. What they actually pointed out, and I think it's important to talk about, is that the difficult situation that Palestinians face in Lebanon, they still have opportunities to work with UNRWA or local associations or receive income from their relatives abroad. So that makes it possible for them to obtain money despite the difficulties of acquiring it in the country. But from my friend's perspective, and I think that is important to highlight, the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, they need a legal definition of their status in order to clarify their identity and recognizing the significant challenges faced by refugees in terms of loss of home. It's also important addressing this not only in humanitarian terms, but also in political challenges. And I think these lessons can contribute to developing more informed and effective approaches in addressing the needs and rights of recently displaced Palestinians from Gaza, but also from any other affected regions, right? But I think what is also important, that something we can learn from the Palestinian refugee community in general, not only in Lebanon, but like worldwide, is that although Palestinian refugees have been living outside their homeland for more than 75 years now, they still identify themselves as Palestinians, and they feel very much connected and belonging to a homeland that most of them have never lived in or even were allowed to visit. So they keep their identity and feeling of belonging through various different ways. And I think that's a very important lesson to take with us, that Palestinians won't give up their identity and they won't give up their right of or wish to return. We, like many Palestinians now who are now displaced, have been displaced before. So I think we see and we have learned that this collective trauma is not going away if we don't find a political solution to it. And I think that's something we can see from the Lebanese case, but also from the other cases of Palestinian refugees in the region.
Thank you. Yes, collective intergenerational trauma, as you say, multiple experiences of repeated displacement sometimes, and important lessons to learn about Palestinian identity and the need for a long-term sustainable political solution. You've helped us picture the ways in which young people in Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon are trying to take agency and identifying potential partners. So you mentioned collaborations with partnering up with Lebanese youth as a sort of a grassroots way of taking more control, being able to build a different kind of future. You've also mentioned that NGOs actually sometimes inadvertently play a role in actually perpetuating the victim status. And of course, that's true. And there are many other factors. So we should be cautious of the assumption that the solution to these problems is for external agencies and international organizations, as well-meaning as they are, to come in with a kind of a plan, a roadmap for this. But that said, based on your research, what kinds of resources, what kinds of support do you think that Palestinian refugees in Lebanon and elsewhere most need at this point to help them do the work that they are already doing, in some cases, visualize and move towards a more secure, self-determined future?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things that I heard in my research is that the Palestinian refugees need legal protection and documentation, because that would actually give them rights that they can claim. And with that, they would also become visible as their own agents and not only dependent on other actors. So I think legal protection documentation is very important. It's very hard. It means changing the system from the bottom. But still, I think it's worth mentioning it. But I also think mental health and psychological support is very important. I mean, due to this like intergenerational trauma, but also because it's still very stigmatized in the communities and it's still regarded as a taboo. But it's important to deal with this ongoing collective trauma that Palestinians have experienced and still experiencing. And I know from like conversations with Palestinians in Lebanon that in general, they are very much affected by what is going on in the West Bank and in Gaza. So when something in the past has happened in Gaza, they always organize demonstrations in solidarity with Gaza or the West Bank, because it's their form of solidarity and feeling of connectedness. But in particular right now, people are suffering with what is going on in Gaza. People still have relatives there. So they feel very much connected, and it influences their life to a huge extent. But there's no space to actually articulate and talk about it. Of course, I think refugees do need their basic needs and services covered. They need employment and livelihood opportunities. But I also think it's important to not regard the refugee communities in pure humanitarian terms any longer. I think we need to start thinking about refugee communities much more in political terms, which also means we need to reconsider the humanitarian work that these NGOs are doing in the camps. Because as it's now, or as it has been in the past, Palestinian bodies has been very much seen as bodies to be fed and taken care of physically, but they're not regarded as political agents. So I think we need to start thinking differently about what kind of work these NGOs are actually doing and what advocacy work and empowerment for the Palestinian communities actually means. And I think lastly, we need to keep the conversation going, to not forget that we actually have a population of Palestinians who have been refugees for more than 75 years now. So we're not forgetting about them.
Absolutely. Really important points there. The visibility, the rights as a fundamental issue that governments can help make change on. What you said about mental health and psychological support really chimes with another of our podcast guests who talked to us about experiences of forced displacement, Dr. Wahid Arian, who really underlined the vital need for trauma-informed care and a holistic health system, health support system. And then you're absolutely right that rethinking what humanitarian work does, rethinking the way in which it actually maybe continues to victimize people by treating Palestinian bodies as passive rather than agential, is something that needs rethinking, and thinking more about political agency. And of course, there are really wonderful organizations around the world that are doing this kind of work, not necessarily in Palestinian refugee camps, but this is absolutely true for organizations that are using, in particular, arts-based practices to help empower young people and other people to find their voices, to articulate their voices, to have platforms and to be change makers themselves. So there is important work. It's not that this isn't going on, but having that scale up, and while an ongoing questioning of standard models, dominant forms of humanitarian crisis response and refugee work is something that would be valuable. Anna, thank you so much for a really interesting and important conversation. You've shared a huge amount of light on a very complex, long-running situation, which, of course, we've focused our conversation around Palestinian refugee experiences in Lebanon. But as we said at the start, and as you've said throughout, this has a lot to teach us about refugee experiences in many other places and for many other communities. So I'm really grateful to you for talking us through all of this and really helping us visualize these very specific, very challenging experiences where visualizing a peaceful future is important but hard.
Thank you very much for giving me the space to share all of this with you.
Thank you also to you, our listeners, for joining us again. We do have more episodes coming up over the winter and spring as we continue to explore experiences of conflict and peace building in different periods and places. So please do keep tuning in. If you'd like to support our project, please do share or subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever platform you use. And please leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts because it helps other people find the show. If you'd like to join the conversation further, you can follow us on social media. Just search for Visualising War or get in touch directly by emailing us at viswar@standrews.ac.uk. Our theme music was composed by Jonathan Young. The show was mixed by Zafir Gertin. Thank you for listening.